Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, we return to the Pentamerone. This will be one of the longest and sweariest episodes of Games from Folktales. If you usually listen to it with small children nearby, you'll want to skip this one and come back later. The Neapolitan nobles are still indulging in their great love of potty humour, but in these stories things also get a little violent.
Chapter 20. The Stone in the Cock's Head. Recording by Joy Chan. The robber's wife does not always laugh. He who weaves fraud works his own ruin. There is no deceit which is not at last discovered, no treachery that does not come to light. Walls have ears and are spies to rogues. The earth gapes and discovers theft, as I will prove to you if you pay attention. There was once in the city of Dark Grotto a certain man named Minecco Aniello, who was so persecuted by fortune that all his fixtures and movables consisted only of a short-legged cock, which he had reared upon breadcrumbs.
As a note, the city of Naples has many grottos underneath it. It's notorious for buildings suddenly subsiding into caverns. It's a centre of the Sibylline cult, which predated House Titalis and House Tremare.
But one morning, being pinched with appetite, for hunger drives the wolf from the thicket, he took it into his head to sell the cock, and, taking it to the market, he met two thievish magicians, with whom he made a bargain, and sold it for half a crown. So they told him to take it to their house, and they would count him out the money. Then the magicians went their way, and Minecco Aniello, following them, overheard them talking gibberish together, and saying, "Who would have told us that we should meet with such a piece of good luck, Generone? This cock will make our fortune to a certainty by the stone which, you know, he has in his pate. We will quickly have it set in a ring, and then we shall have everything we can ask for."
In the original, they are called necromancers. I'd caution that necromancer just means evil magician, not necessarily worker with the undead. Note also that the gibberish in the original is a thieves' cant. Now, that's interesting. In English, thieves' cant comes from the Elizabethan period. Folkloristically, it evolved from Romani, which was created by a man given the title of the King of Gypsies, and he invented it in a cave called the Devil's Arse. The cave actually exists. It's in Derbyshire. This is all profoundly unlikely, but by the Jacobean period, it's well enough known that people can slip words of it into plays to make them sound more street. Did you see how street I sounded then? What argot the Neapolitans are using is profoundly unclear.
"Be quiet, Giacovuccio," answered Generone. "I see myself rich and can hardly believe it. And I am longing to twist the cock's neck and give a kick in the face of beggary, for in this world virtue without money goes for nothing, and a man is judged of by his coat." When Minecco Aniello, who had travelled about in the world and eaten bread from more than one oven, heard this gibberish, he turned on his heel and scampered off, and running home he twisted the cock's neck, and opening its head found the stone, which he had instantly set in a brass ring. Then, to make a trial of its virtue, he said, "I wish to become a youth 18 years old." Hardly had he uttered the words when his blood began to flow more quickly, his nerves became stronger, his limbs firmer, his flesh fresher, his eyes more fiery, his silver hairs were turned into gold, his mouth, which was a sacked village, became peopled with teeth, his beard, which was as thick as a wood, became like a nursery garden. In short, he was changed to a most beautiful youth. Then he said again, "I wish for a splendid palace, and to marry the king's daughter." And lo! there instantly appeared a palace of incredible magnificence, in which were apartments that would amaze you, columns to astound you, pictures to fill you with wonder. Silver glittered around, and gold was trodden under foot. The jewels dazzled your eyes. The servants swarmed like ants. The horses and carriages were not to be counted. In short, there was such a display of riches that the king stared at the sight, and willingly gave him his daughter Natalizia. Meanwhile the magicians, having discovered Minecco Aniello's great wealth, laid a plan to rob him of his good fortune. So they made a pretty little doll which played and danced by means of clockwork, and, dressing themselves like merchants, they went to Pentella, the daughter of Minecco Aniello, under pretext of selling it to her. When Pentella saw the beautiful little thing, she asked them what price they put upon it, and they replied that it was not to be bought with money, but that she might have it, and welcome, if she would only do them a favour, which was to let them see the make of the ring which her father possessed, in order to take the model and make another like it. Then they would give her the doll without any payment at all.
The history of automata has been covered with great thoroughness in Ars Magica. These mechanisms are of deep interest to House Verditus, as it happens that house is based in Sardinia, which is a sort of fey place, but nearby-ish in these stories.
Pentella, who had never heard the proverb, "Think well before you buy anything cheap," instantly accepted this offer, and, bidding them return the next morning, she promised to ask her father to lend her the ring. So the magicians went away, and when her father returned home, Pentella coaxed and caressed him, until at last she persuaded him to give her the ring, making the excuse that she was sad at heart and wished to divert her mind a little. When the next day came, as soon as the scavenger of the sun sweeps the last traces of the shades from the streets and squares of heaven, the magicians returned, and no sooner had they the ring in their hands than they instantly vanished, and not a trace of them was to be seen, so that poor Pentella had like to have died with terror. But when the magicians came to a wood, where the branches of some of the trees were dancing the sword dance, and the boughs of the others were playing together at hot cockles, they desired the ring to destroy the spell by which the old man had become young again. And instantly Minecco Aniello, who was just at that moment in the presence of the king, was suddenly seen to grow hoary, his hairs to whiten, his forehead to wrinkle, his eyebrows to grow bristly, his eyes to sink in, his face to be furrowed, his mouth to become toothless, his beard to grow bushy, his back to be humped, his legs to tremble, and, above all, his glittering garments to turn to rags and tatters. The king, seeing the miserable beggar seated beside him at table, ordered him to be instantly driven away with blows and hard words, whereupon Aniello, thus suddenly fallen from his good luck, went weeping to his daughter, and asked for the ring in order to set matters to rights again. But when he heard the fatal trick played by the false merchants, he was ready to throw himself out of the window, cursing 1,000 times the ignorance of his daughter, who, for the sake of a silly doll, had turned him into a miserable scarecrow, and for a paltry thing of rags had brought him to rags himself, adding that he was resolved to go wandering about the world like a bad shilling, until he should get tidings of those merchants. So saying, he threw a cloak about his neck and a wallet on his back, drew his sandals on his feet, took a staff in his hand, and leaving his daughter all chilled and frozen, he set out, walking desperately on and on, until he arrived at the kingdom of Deep Hole, inhabited by the mice, where, being taken for a big spy of the cats, he was instantly led before Rosecone, the king. Then the king asked him who he was, whence he came, and what he was about in that country. And Minecco Aniello, after first giving the king a cheese-paring, in sign of tribute, related to him all his misfortunes one by one, and concluded by saying that he was resolved to continue his toil and travel until he should get tidings of those thievish villains who had robbed him of so precious a jewel, taking from him at once the flower of his youth, the source of his wealth, and the prop of his honour.
Rosecone doesn't seem to show up in other folklore, but he's an interesting fellow and would be suitable as a Covenant ally.
At these words Rosecone felt pity nibbling at his heart, and wishing to comfort the poor man, he summoned the eldest mice to a council, and asked their opinions on the misfortunes of Minecco Aniello, commanding them to use all diligence and endeavour to obtain some tidings of these false merchants. Now among the rest it happened that Ridolo and Saltariello were present, mice who were well used to the ways of the world, and had lived for 6 years at a tavern of great resort hard by. And they said to Aniello, "Be of good heart, comrade, matters will turn out better than you imagine. You must know that one day, when we were in a room in the hostelry of the Horn, where the most famous men in the world lodge and make merry, 2 persons from Hook Castle came in, who, after they had eaten their fill and had seen the bottom of their flagon, fell to talking of a trick they had played a certain old man of Dark Grotto, and how they had cheated him out of a stone of great value, which one of them, named Jennarone, said he would never take from his finger, that he might not run the risk of losing it as the old man's daughter had done." When Minecco Aniello heard this, he told the 2 mice that if they would trust themselves to accompany him to the country where these rogues lived and recover the ring for him, he would give them a good lot of cheese and salt meat, which they might eat and enjoy with his Majesty the King. Then the 2 mice, after bargaining for a reward, offered to go over sea and mountain, and, taking leave of his mousy Majesty, they set out. After journeying a long way, they arrived at Hook Castle, where the mice told Minecco Aniello to remain under some trees on the brink of a river, which, like a leech, drew the moisture from the land and discharged it into the sea. Then they went to seek the house of the magicians, and, observing that Jennarone never took the ring from his finger, they sought to gain the victory by stratagem. So, waiting till night had dyed with purple grape juice the sunburnt face of heaven, and the magicians had gone to bed and were fast asleep, Rodolpho began to nibble the finger on which the ring was, whereupon Jennarone, feeling the smart, took the ring off and laid it on a table at the head of the bed. But as soon as Saltariello saw this, he popped the ring into his mouth, and in 4 skips he was off to find Minecco Aniello, who, with even greater joy than a man at the gallows feels when a pardon arrives, instantly turned the magicians into 2 jackasses, and, turning his mantle over one of them, he bestrode him like a noble count. Then he loaded the other with cheese and bacon, and set off toward Deep Hole, where, having given presents to the king and his counsellors, he thanked them for all the good fortune he had received by their assistance, praying heaven that no mouse-trap might ever lay hold of them, that no cat might ever harm them, and that no arsenic might ever poison them. Then, leaving that country, Minecco Aniello returned to Dark Grotto even more handsome than before, and was received by the king and his daughter with the greatest affection in the world. And having ordered the 2 asses to be cast down from a rock, he lived happily with his wife, never more taking the ring from his finger, that he might not again commit such a folly. For the cat who has been burnt with fire ever after fears the cold hearthstone.
In the Penguin edition, the merchant gives them lard and cheese, not bacon. The asses are thrown off a mountain, and oddly, the saying at the end is changed from a dog scalded by hot water will be afraid of cold water too. It's interesting to wonder where the ring went, and how the magicians knew the cock had the stone in its head.
Chapter 21. The 3 Enchanted Princes. Recording by Joy Chan. Once upon a time the King of Greenbank had 3 daughters, who were perfect jewels, with whom 3 sons of the King of Fairmeadow were desperately in love. But these princes having been changed into animals by the spell of a fairy, the King of Greenbank disdained to give them his daughters to wife. Whereupon the first, who was a beautiful falcon, called together all the birds to a council, and there came the chaffinches, tomtits, woodpeckers, flycatchers, jays, blackbirds, cuckoos, thrushes, and every other kind of bird. And when they were all assembled at his summons, he ordered them to destroy all the blossoms on the trees of Greenbank, so that not a flower or leaf should remain. The second prince, who was a stag, summoning all the goats, rabbits, hares, hedgehogs, and other animals of that country, laid waste all the cornfields, so that there was not a single blade of grass or corn left. The third prince, who was a dolphin, consulting together with 100 monsters of the sea, made such a tempest arise upon the coast that not a boat escaped. Now the king saw that matters were going from bad to worse, and that he could not remedy the mischief which these 3 wild lovers were causing. So he resolved to get out of his trouble, and made up his mind to give them his daughters to wife. And thereupon, without wanting either feasts or songs, they carried their brides off and out of the kingdom.
The peasants get very little interest in these stories. The stories are pitched to nobility, or at least to the clerisy. The things mentioned above by the lovers would cause famine. Basically, the princes are mass murderers. This will be ignored.
On parting from her daughters, Granzolla the queen gave each of them a ring, one exactly like the other, telling them that if they happened to be separated, and after a while to meet again, or to see any of their kinsfolk, they would recognize one another by means of these rings.
This may be an arcane connection.
So taking their leave they departed, and the falcon carried Fabiella, who was the eldest of the sisters, to the top of a mountain, which was so high that, passing the confines of the clouds, it reached with a dry head to a region where it never rains, and there, leading her to a most beautiful palace, she lived like a queen.
The court of the birds was described in some detail in Realms of Power Magic, but this fellow sounds more like a fairy prince to me.
The stag carried Vasta, the second sister, into a wood, which was so thick that the shades, when summoned by the night, could not find their way out to escort her. There he placed her, as befitted her rank, in a wonderfully splendid house with a garden.
The translation we're using cuts out half a line from the Penguin edition here. Splendid house with a garden, where he had her live as his equal. So at least he's not a misogynist.
The dolphin swam with Rita, the third sister, on his back into the middle of the sea, where, upon a large rock, he showed her a mansion in which 3 crowned kings might live. Meanwhile, Granzolla gave birth to a fine little boy, whom they named Tittone. And when he was 15 years old, hearing his mother lamenting continually that she never heard any tidings of her 3 daughters, who were married to 3 animals, he took it into his head to travel through the world until he should obtain some news of them. So after begging and entreating his father and mother for a long time, they granted him permission, bidding him take for his journey attendants and everything needful and befitting a prince. And the queen also gave him another ring, similar to those she had given to her daughters. Tittone went his way, and left no corner of Italy, not a nook of France, nor any part of Spain unsearched. Then he passed through England, and traversed Slavonia, and visited Poland, and, in short, travelled both east and west.
The Slavonia in this edition is Flanders in the Penguin edition. Flanders is not exotic at all, if you are a Victorian English person, which presumably is why it's been swapped out not only here, but in some of the other stories.
At length, leaving all his servants, some at the taverns and some at the hospitals, he set out without a farthing in his pocket.
You could, of course, track him using these people. The strangest set of Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs so far discovered in folklore.
And came to the top of the mountain, where dwelt the falcon and Fabiella. And as he stood there beside himself with amazement, contemplating the beauty of the palace, the cornerstones of which were of porphyry, the walls of alabaster, the windows of gold, and the tiles of silver.
Porphyry is a purple stone associated with emperors. The Pope also has a throne of porphyry. It was originally a birthing chair, so it has a hole in the bottom, which has led to many odd myths about Pope Joan and the fondling of the papal testicles after his election.
His sister observed him, and ordering him to be called, she demanded who he was, whence he came, and what chance had brought him to that country. When Tittone told her his country, his father and mother, and his name, Fabiella knew him to be her brother, and the more when she compared the ring upon his finger with that which her mother had given her. And embracing him with great joy, she concealed him, fearing that her husband would be angry when he returned home. As soon as the falcon came home, Fabiella began to tell him that a great longing had come over her to see her parents. And the falcon answered, "Let the wish pass, wife, for that cannot be unless the humour takes me." "Let us at least," said Fabiella, "send to fetch one of my kinsfolk to keep my company." "And pray who will come so far to see you?" replied the falcon. "Nay, but if any one should come," added Fabiella, "would you be displeased?" "Why should I be displeased?" said the falcon. It would be enough that he were one of your kinsfolk to make me take him to my heart." When Fabiella heard this she took courage, and calling to her brother to come forth, she presented him to the Falcon, who exclaimed, "5 and 5 are 10. Love passes through the glove and water through the boot. A hearty welcome to you. You are master in this house. Command and do just as you like." Then he gave orders that Tittone should be served and treated with the same honour as himself. Now when Tittone had stayed a fortnight on the mountain, it came into his head to go forth and seek his other sisters. So taking leave of Fabiella and his brother-in-law, the Falcon gave him one of his feathers, saying, "Take this and prize it, my dear Tittone, for you may one day be in trouble, and you will then esteem it a treasure. Enough, take good care of it, and if ever you meet with any mishap, throw it on the ground and say, 'Come hither, come hither,' and you shall have cause to thank me." Tittone wrapped the feather up in a sheet of paper, and, putting it in his pocket, after 1,000 ceremonies, departed. And travelling on and on a very long way, he arrived at last at the wood where the stag lived with Vasta. And going, half dead with hunger, into the garden to pluck some fruit, his sister saw him, and recognised him in the same manner as Fabiella had done. Then she presented Tittone to her husband, who received him with the greatest friendship, and treated him truly like a prince. At the end of a fortnight, when Tittone wished to depart and go in search of his other sister, the stag gave him one of his hares, repeating the same words as the Falcon had spoken about the feather. And setting out on his way with a bag full of crown pieces which the Falcon had given him, and as many more which the stag gave him, he walked on, until he came to the end of the earth, where, being stopped by the sea, and unable to walk any further, he took ship, intending to seek through all the islands for tidings of his sister. So setting sail, he went about and about, until at length he was carried to an island, where lived the Dolphin with Rita. And no sooner had he landed than his sister saw and recognised him in the same manner as the others had done, and he was received by her husband with all possible affection. Now after a while Tittone wished to set out again to go and visit his father and mother, whom he had not seen for so long a time. So the Dolphin gave him one of his scales, telling him the same as the others had. And Tittone, mounting a horse, set out on his travels.
In mythic Europe, dolphins are fish, hence they have scales.
But he had hardly proceeded half a mile from the seashore, when entering a wood, the abode of fear in the shades, where a continual fear of darkness and terror was kept up, he found a great tower in the middle of a lake, whose waters were kissing the feet of the trees, and entreating them not to let the sun witness their pranks. At a window in the tower Tittone saw a most beautiful maiden sitting at the feet of a hideous dragon who was asleep. When the damsel saw Tittone, she said in a low and piteous voice, "O noble youth, sent perchance by heaven to comfort me in my miseries in this place, where the face of a Christian is never seen, release me from the power of this tyrannical serpent, who has carried me off from my father, the King of Bright Valley, and shut me up in this frightful tower, where I must die a miserable death." "Alas, my beauteous lady," replied Tittone, "what can I do to serve thee? Who can pass this lake? Who can climb this tower? Who can approach yon horrid dragon that carries terror in his look, sows fear, and causes dismay to spring up?"
The last phrase is actually generates diarrhea. Is this a spell-like power that can be countered with a brave check? We have a spell that does that sort of thing in the fairy magic section of House Marinita.
"But softly, wait a minute, and we'll find a way with another's help to drive this serpent away. Step by step, the more haste the worse speed. We shall soon see whether 'tis egg or wind." And so saying, he threw the feather, the hair, and the scale, which his brothers-in-law had given him, on the ground, exclaiming, "Come hither, come hither!" And falling on the earth like drops of summer rain, which makes the frogs spring up, suddenly there appeared the Falcon, the Stag, and the Dolphin, who cried out all together, "Behold us here! What are your commands?"
The story concerning The summer rain causing the frogs to spring up is an example of the mythic and medieval European belief in the spontaneous generation of small animals. This is actually true in Ars Magica, which is why certain spells cause meat to dissolve into a pile of flies and maggots. No actual fly or maggot is needed to give life to these flies and maggots. They generate themselves from the decay.
When Tittone saw this, he said with great joy, I wish for nothing but to release this poor damsel from the claws of yon dragon, to take her away from this tower, to lay it all in ruins, and to carry this beautiful lady home with me as my wife. Hush, answered the falcon, for the bean springs up where you least expect it. We'll soon make him dance upon a sixpence, and take good care that he shall have little ground enough. Let us lose no time, said the stag. Troubles and macaroni are swallowed hot. So the falcon summoned a large flock of griffins, who, flying to the window of the tower, carried off the damsel, bearing her over the lake to where Tittone was standing with his 3 brothers-in-law. And if from afar she appeared a moon, believe me, when near she looked truly like a sun, she was so beautiful. Whilst Tittone was embracing her and telling her how he loved her, the dragon awoke, and rushing out of the window, he came swimming across the lake to devour Tittone. But the stag instantly called up a squadron of lions, tigers, panthers, bears, and wild cats.
The Penguin edition doesn't say wildcats, it says bogies.
Who, falling upon the dragon, tore him in pieces with their claws. Then Tittone, wishing to depart, the dolphin said, I likewise desire to do something to serve you. And in order that no trace should remain of the frightful and accursed place, he made the sea rise so high that, overflowing its bounds, it attacked the tower furiously, and overthrew it to its foundations. When Tittone saw these things, he thanked the animals in the best manner he could, telling the damsel at the same time that she ought to do so too, as it was by their aid she had escaped from peril. But the animals answered, Nay, we ought rather to thank this beauteous lady, since she is the means of restoring us to our proper shapes. For a spell was laid upon us at our birth, caused by our mothers having offended a fairy, and we were compelled to remain in the form of animals until we should have freed the daughter of a king from some great trouble. And now behold, the time is arrived which we have longed for. The fruit is ripe, and we already feel new spirit in our breasts, new blood in our veins. So saying, they were changed into 3 handsome youths, and one after another they embraced their brother-in-law, and shook hands with the lady, who was in an ecstasy of joy. When Tittone saw this, he was on the point of fainting away, and heaving a deep sigh, he said, O heavens! Why have not my mother and father a share in this happiness? They would be out of their wits with joy were they to see such graceful and handsome sons-in-law before their eyes. Nay, answered the princes, 'tis not yet night. The shame at seeing ourselves so transformed obliged us to flee from the sight of men. But now that, thank heaven, we can appear in the world again, we will all go and live with our wives under one roof, and spend our lives merrily. Let us therefore set out instantly, and before the sun tomorrow morning unpacks the bales of his rays at the custom-house of the East, our wives shall be with you. So saying, in order that they might not have to go on foot, for there was only an old broken-down mare which Tittone had brought, the brothers caused a most beautiful coach to appear, drawn by 6 lions, in which they all 5 seated themselves, and having travelled the whole day, they came in the evening to a tavern, where, whilst the supper was being prepared, they passed the time in reading all the proofs of men's ignorance which were scribbled upon the walls.
Graffiti has an extremely long history in Europe, and I presume it's one of the ways that redcaps leave messages for each other.
At length, when all had eaten their fill and retired to rest, the 3 youths, feigning to go to bed, went out and walked about the whole night long, till in the morning, when the stars, like bashful maidens, retire from the gaze of the sun, they found themselves in the same inn with their wives, whereupon there was a great embracing and a joy beyond the beyonds. Then they all eight seated themselves in the same coach, and after a long journey arrived at Greenbank, where they were received with incredible affection by the King and Queen, who had not only regained the capital of 4 children, whom they had considered lost, but likewise the interest of 3 sons-in-law and a daughter-in-law, who were verily 4 columns of the Temple of Beauty. And when the news of the adventures of their children was brought to the kings of Fair Meadow and Bright Valley, they both came to the feasts which were made, adding the rich ingredient of joy to the porridge of their satisfaction, and receiving a full recompense for all their past misfortunes. For 1 hour of joy dispels the cares and sufferings of 1,000 years. Chapter 22. The Dragon. Recording by Joy Chan. He who seeks the injury of another finds his own hurt, and he who spreads the snares of treachery and deceit often falls into them himself, as you shall hear in the story of a queen, who with her own hands constructed the trap in which she was caught by the foot. There was one time a king of High Shore who practised such tyranny and cruelty that, whilst he was once gone on a visit of pleasure to a castle at a distance from the city, his royal seat was usurped by a certain sorceress. Whereupon, having consulted a wooden statue which used to give oracular responses, it answered that he would recover his dominions when the sorceress should lose her sight.
Is this a fairy oracle?
But seeing that the sorceress, besides being well guarded, knew at a glance the people whom he sent to annoy her, and did dog's justice upon them, he became quite desperate, and out of spite to her he killed all the women of that place whom he could get into his hands.
Oddly, for this story, he's still technically the hero. I mean, the sorceress is clearly breaking the code of Hermes here by usurping a throne, but so far she seems better than the king. The spell she's using that allows her to see who will betray her is known to the Order of Hermes. Some covenants use it upon their grogs. Overuse can cause psychological problems.
Now after hundreds and hundreds had been led thither by their ill luck, only to lose their lives, there chanced among others to come a maiden named Porziella, the most beautiful creature that could be seen on the whole earth, and the king could not help falling in love with her and making her his wife. But he was so cruel and spiteful to women that, after a while, he was going to kill her like the rest. But just as he was raising the dagger, a bird let fall a certain root upon his arm, and he was seized with such a trembling that the weapon fell from his hand.
I know there's a Magonomia spell for that. I presume there is similarly a spell that creates palsy in Ars Magica.
This bird was a fairy who, a few days before, having gone to sleep in a wood, where beneath the tent of the shades Fear kept watch and defied the sun's heat, a certain satyr was about to rob her.
Oddly, the Penguin edition agrees that it's rob. Satyrs are notorious for other types of crime.
When she was awakened by Porziella, and for this kindness she continually followed her steps in order to make her a return. When the king saw this, he thought that the beauty of Porziella's face had arrested his arm and bewitched the dagger to prevent its piercing her as it had done so many others. He resolved, therefore, not to make the attempt a second time, but that she should die built up in a garret of his palace. No sooner said than done. The unhappy creature was enclosed within 4 walls without having anything to eat or drink, and left to waste away and die little by little.
This seems a convoluted sort of way to go around this. Also, would you blame Porziella if at this point she grabbed the knife and drove it into his gut? If she'd done that, she might need some helpful magicians to sort out her many problems.
The bird, seeing her in this wretched state, consoled her with kind words, bidding her be of good cheer, and promising, in return for the great kindness she had done her, to aid her, if necessary, with her very life. In spite, however, of all the entreaties of Porziella, the bird would never tell her who she was, but only said that she was under obligations to her, and would leave nothing undone to serve her. And seeing that the poor girl was famished with hunger, she flew out and speedily returned with a pointed knife which she had taken from the king's pantry, and told her to make a hole in the corner of the floor just over the kitchen, through which she would regularly bring her food to sustain her life. So Porziella bored away until she had made a passage for the bird, who, watching till the cook was gone out to fetch a pitcher of water from the well, went down through the hole, and taking a fine fowl that was cooking at the fire, brought it to Porziella. Then, to relieve her thirst, not knowing how to carry her any drink, she flew to the pantry, where there was a quantity of grapes hanging, and brought her a fine bunch, and this she did regularly for many days.
The idea that the magical bird brings her a fowl to eat, that is, another bird, is slightly disturbing, but fairies can be like that. Perhaps it's a predatory bird.
Meanwhile, Porziella gave birth to a fine little boy, whom she suckled and reared with the constant aid of the bird. And when he was grown big, the fairy advised his mother to make the hole larger, and to raise so many boards off the floor as would allow Miuccio, for so the child was called, to pass through, and then, after letting him down with some cords which the bird brought, to put the boards back into their place, that it might not be seen where he came from. So Porziella did as the bird directed her, and as soon as the cook was gone out, she let down her son, desiring him never to tell whence he came, nor whose son he was. When the cook returned and saw such a fine little boy, he asked him who he was, whence he came, and what he wanted. Whereupon the child, remembering his mother's advice, said that he was a poor forlorn boy who was looking about for a master. As they were talking, the butler came in, and seeing the sprightly little fellow, he thought he would make a pretty page for the king. So he led him to the royal apartments, and when the king saw him look so handsome and lovely that he appeared a very jewel, he was vastly pleased with him, and took him into his service as a page, and to his heart as a son, and had him taught all the exercises befitting a cavalier, so that Miuccio grew up the most accomplished one in the court, and the king loved him much better than his stepson. Now the king's stepmother, who was really the queen, on this account began to take a dislike to him, and to hold him in aversion, and her envy and malice gained ground just in proportion as the favours and kindness which the king bestowed on Miuccio cleared the way for them. So she resolved to soap the ladder of his fortune, in order that he should tumble down from top to bottom. Accordingly, one evening, when the king and his stepmother had tuned their instruments together, and were making music of their discourse, the queen told the king that Miuccio had boasted he would build 3 castles in the air. So the next morning, at the time when the moon, the schoolmistress of the shades, gives a holiday to her scholars for the festival of the sun, the king, either from surprise or to gratify the old queen, ordered Miuccio to be called, and commanded him forthwith to build the 3 castles in the air as he had promised, or else he would make him dance a jig in the air. When Miuccio heard this, he went to his chamber and began to lament bitterly, seeing what glass the favour of princes is, and how short a time it lasts. And while he was weeping thus, lo, the bird came and said to him, "Take heart, Miuccio, and fear not while you have me by your side, for I am able to draw you out of the fire." Then she directed him to take pasteboard and glue, and make 3 large castles. And calling up 3 large griffins, she tied a castle to each, and away they flew up into the air.
The fairy obviously doesn't want to rescue the woman, because she has 3 griffins under her control. She could crack the top off that tower like an egg.
Thereupon Miuccio called the king, who came running with all his court to see the sight. And when he saw the ingenuity of Miuccio, he had a still greater affection for him, and lavished on him caresses of the other world, which added snow to the envy of the queen, and fire to her rage, seeing that all her plans failed. Insomuch that, both sleeping and waking, she was for ever thinking of some way to remove this thorn from her eyes. So at last, after some days, she said to the king, "Son, the time is now come for us to return to our former greatness and the pleasures of past times, since Miuccio has offered to blind the sorceress, and by the disbursement of her eyes to make you recover your lost kingdom." The king, who felt himself touched in the sore place, called for Miuccio that very instant, and said to him, "I am greatly surprised that, notwithstanding all my love for you, and that you have the power to restore me to the seat from which I have fallen, you remain thus careless, instead of endeavouring to relieve me from the misery I am in, reduced thus from a kingdom to a wood, from a city to a paltry castle, and from commanding so great a people to be hardly waited on by a parcel of half-starved menials. If, therefore, you do not wish me ill, run now at once and blind the eyes of the fairy who has possession of my property, for by putting out her lanterns you will light the lamps of my honour that are now dark and dismal." When Miuccio heard this proposal, he was about to reply that the king was ill-informed and had mistaken him, as he was neither a raven to pick out eyes, nor an auger to bore holes.
In the Penguin edition, it's a latrine cleaner with which to unclog holes. I kind of wish he'd gone the other way, because if he was a plumber who got back a kingdom by fighting the evil that had overtaken it, he would be one of the earliest folkloristic antecedents of Mario and Luigi.
But the king said, "No more words. So I will have it, so let it be done. Remember now that in the mint of this brain of mine I have the balance ready. In one scale the reward if you do what I tell you, in the other the punishment if you neglect doing what I command." Miuccio, who could not butt against a rock, and had to do with a man who was not to be moved, went into a corner to bemoan himself, and the bird came to him and said, "Is it possible, Miuccio, that you will always be drowning yourself in a tumbler of water? If I were dead, indeed you could not make more fuss. Do you not know that I have more regard for your life than for my own? Therefore don't lose courage. Come with me, and you shall see what I can do." So saying, off she flew and alighted in the wood, where as soon as she began to chirp, there came a large flock of birds about her, to whom she told the story, assuring them that whoever would venture to deprive the sorceress of sight should have from her a safeguard against the talons of the hawks and kites, and a letter of protection against the guns, crossbows, longbows, and birdlime of the fowlers.
I mentioned birdlime in the episode about eating ortolans. Birdlime is a sticky substance which is put on branches so that birds adhere to them, allowing them to be plucked from the trees like fruit.
There was among them a swallow who had made her nest against a beam of the royal palace, and who hated the sorceress because, when making her accursed conjurations, she had several times driven her out of the chamber with her fumigations.
Magonomia note, fumigation sounds alchemical. There are theoretically fumigations in some other styles of magic, particularly theurgy, to cleanse the space. Those sorts of fumigations, though, mightn't disturb birds in the same way. They tend to be made of expensive resins.
For which reason, partly out of a desire of revenge, and partly to gain the reward that the bird promised, she offered herself to perform the service. So away she flew like lightning to the city, and entering the palace, found the fairy lying on a couch, with two damsels fanning her. Then the swallow came, and alighting directly over the fairy, pecked out her eyes.
This sounds unlikely. Swallows have tiny, tiny bills. We might ask if it differs from the African swallow, which has perhaps a higher wing speed velocity when laden with a coconut, but how would it get to Italy? Are they migratory? Some call me Tim, but they are wrong. Anyway, in the Penguin edition, the swallow shits in her eyes. There are several ways this may have proven efficacious. One is that the blindness, however temporary, fulfills the condition of the prophecy, and the sorceress, being a fairy, must leave. Another is that bird faeces is particularly caustic. A third, and perhaps my favourite, because it's so disgusting, is that the bird droppings cause a magically accelerated case of ocular histoplasmosis. This is a disease caused in the real world by contact with spores found in bird dung. The spores flourish in the eyes and create scarring, and this is interpreted as dark spots in the field of vision. Severe cases can cause legal blindness. In the real world, this takes decades to get to this stage.
Whereupon the fairy, thus seeing night at midday, knew that by this closing of the custom-house the merchandise of the kingdom was all lost, and uttering yells as of a condemned soul, she abandoned the sceptre and went off to hide herself in a certain cave, where she knocked her head continually against the wall, until at length she ended her days.
Well, there's some corpus viz. One thing you have to say about adventuring parties in Ars Magica, they do clean the place up a lot better than adventuring parties in other role-playing games.
When the sorceress was gone, the councillors sent ambassadors to the king, praying him to come back to his castle, since the blinding of the sorceress had caused him to see this happy day. And at the same time they arrived came also Miuccio, who, by the bird's direction, said to the king, "I have served you to the best of my power. The sorceress is blinded, the kingdom is yours. Wherefore, if I deserve recompense for this service, I wish for no other than to be left to my ill fortune, without being again exposed to these dangers." But the king, embracing him with great affection, bade him put on his cap and sit beside him. And how the queen was enraged at this, Heaven knows, for by the bow of many colours that appeared in her face might be known the wind of the storm that was brewing in her heart against poor Miuccio. Not far from this castle lived a most ferocious dragon, who was born the same hour with the queen.
In the Penguin edition, they are literal twins. They are, quote, born of the same womb, end quote.
And the astrologers, being called by her father to astrologize on this event, said that his daughter would be safe as long as the dragon was safe, and that when one died, the other would of necessity die also.
This is clearly some sort of non-hermetic familiar bond.
One thing alone could bring back the queen to life, and that was to anoint her temples, chest, nostrils, and pulse with the blood of the same dragon.
Cosmologically, this seems unwise. At best, you get a corpse animated by its own spirit, and at worst you get a fairy pretending to be the queen.
Now the queen, knowing the strength and fury of this animal, resolved to send Miuccio into his claws, well assured that the beast would make but a mouthful of him, and that he would be like a strawberry in the throat of a bear. So turning to the king, she said, "Upon my word, this Miuccio is the treasure of your house, and you would be ungrateful indeed if you did not love him, especially as he had expressed his desire to kill the dragon, who, though he is my brother, is nevertheless your enemy, and I care more for a hair of your head than for 100 brothers."
So even in the Bowdlerized edition, the dragon is her literal brother.
The king, who hated the dragon mortally, and knew not how to remove him out of his sight, instantly called Miuccio and said to him, "I know that you can put your hand to whatever you will. Therefore, as you have done so much, grant me yet another pleasure, and then turn me whithersoever you will. Go this very instant and kill the dragon, for you will do me a singular service, and I will reward you well for it." Miuccio, at these words, was near losing his senses, and as soon as he was able to speak, he said to the king, "Alas, what a headache have you given me by your continually teasing! Is my life a black goatskin rug that you are for ever wearing it away thus? This is not a pared pear ready to drop into one's mouth, but a dragon that tears with his claws, breaks to pieces with his head, crushes with his tail, crunches with his teeth, poisons with his eyes, and kills with his breath."
In Ars Magica, each of those are powers. In Maginomia, each of those are stunts.
"Wherefore do you want to send me to death? Is this the sinecure you gave me for having given you a kingdom? Who is the wicked soul that has set this die on the table? What son of perdition has taught you these capers and put these words into your mouth?" Then the king, who, although he let himself be tossed to and fro as light as a ball, was firmer than a rock in keeping to what he had once said, stamped with his feet and exclaimed, "After all you have done, do you fail at the last? But no more words. Go, rid my kingdom of this plague, unless you would have me rid you of life." Poor Miuccio, who thus received 1 minute a favour, at another a threat, now a pat on the face, and now a kick.
In the Penguin edition, it's a kick in the arse. The removal is why the sentence has such a strange rhythm.
Now a kind word, and now a cruel one, reflected how mutable court fortune is, and would fain have been without the acquaintance of the king. But knowing that to reply to great men is a folly, and like plucking a lion by the beard, he withdrew, cursing his fate, which had led him to the court only to curtail the days of his life. And as he was sitting on one of the doorsteps with his head between his knees, washing his shoes with his tears and warming the ground with his sighs.
In the Penguin edition, he's warming his balls with his sighs. This makes more sense, of course, because his head is between his legs and he's sighing in that position.
Behold, the bird came flying with a plant in her beak, and throwing it to him said, "Get up, Miuccio, and take courage, for you are not going to play at unload the ass with your days, but at backgammon with the life of the dragon. Take this plant, and when you come to the cave of that horrid animal, throw it in, and instantly such a drowsiness will come over him that he will fall fast asleep. Whereupon, nicking and sticking him with a good knife, you may soon make an end of him. Then come away, for things will turn out better than you think."
So that's a spell. In the Penguin edition, the bird reveals that he should stab the dragon in a particularly undignified place.
"Enough!" cried Miuccio. "I know what I carry under my belt. We have more time than money, and he who has time has life." So saying, he got up, and sticking a pruning knife in his belt and taking the plant, he went his way to the dragon's cave.
The pruning knife is basically a large fighting knife in the other version. Imagine a machete or a cane knife rather than a gardener's knife.
Which was under a mountain of such goodly growth that the 3 mountains that were steps to the giants would not have reached up to its waist. When he came there, he threw the plant into the cave, and instantly a deep sleep laid hold on the dragon, and Miuccio began to cut him in pieces.
Which was anticlimactic.
Now just at the time that he was busied thus, the queen felt a cutting pain at her heart, and seeing herself brought to a bad pass, she perceived her error in having purchased death with ready money. So she called her stepson and told him what the astrologers had predicted, how her life depended on that of the dragon, and how she feared that Miuccio had killed him, for she felt herself gradually sliding away. Then the king replied, "If you knew that the life of the dragon was the prop of your life and the root of your days, why did you make me send Miuccio? Who is in fault? You must have done yourself the mischief, and you must suffer for it. You have broken the glass, and you may pay the cost."
Who is this stepson? I'm not quite following where he's come from.
And the queen answered, "I never thought that such a stripling could have the skill and strength to overflow an animal which made nothing of an army, and I expected that he would have left his rags there. But since I reckoned without my host, and the bark of my projects is gone out of its course, do me one kindness if you love me. When I am dead, take a sponge dipped in the blood of this dragon, and anoint with it all the extremities of my body before you bury me."
A bark is, as previously noted, a ship.
"That is but a small thing for the love I bear you," replied the king, "and if the blood of the dragon is not enough, I will add my own to give you satisfaction." The queen was about to thank him, but the breath left her with the speech, for just then Miuccio had made an end of scoring the dragon. No sooner had Miuccio come into the king's presence with the news of what he had done, than the king ordered him to go back for the dragon's blood. But being curious to see the deed done by Miuccio's hand, he followed him. And as Miuccio was going out of the palace gate, the bird met him and said, "Whither are you going?" And Miuccio answered, "I am going whither the king sends me. He makes me fly backwards and forwards like a shuttle, and never lets me rest an hour." "What to do?" said the bird. "To fetch the blood of the dragon," said Miuccio. And the bird replied, "Ah, wretched youth, this dragon's blood will be bull's blood to you and make you burst, for this blood will cause to spring up again the evil seed of all your misfortunes. The queen is continually exposing you to new dangers that you may lose your life. And the king, who lets this odious creature put the pack saddle on him, orders you, like a castaway, to endanger your person, which is his own flesh and blood, and a shoot of his stem."
Oddly less graphic in the Penguin edition, where he is literally broccoli of the same stem. Apparently the English were not familiar with this most formidable of vegetables. My wife loves it. I gave her some for Valentine's Day one year, but enough about me.
"But the wretched man does not know you, though the inborn affection he bears you should have betrayed your kindred. Moreover, the services you have rendered the king, and the gain to himself of so handsome a son and heir, ought to obtain favour for unhappy Porziella, your mother, who has now for 14 years been buried alive in a garret, where is seen a temple of beauty built up within a little chamber." While the fairy was thus speaking, the king, who had heard every word, stepped forward to learn the truth of the matter better, and finding that Miuccio was his own and Porziella's son, and that Porziella was still alive in the garret, he instantly gave orders that she should be set free and brought before him. And when he saw her looking more beautiful than ever, owing to the care taken of her by the bird, he embraced her with the greatest affection, and was never satisfied with pressing to his heart first the mother and then the son, praying forgiveness of Porziella for his ill treatment of her, and of his son for all the dangers to which he had exposed him. Then he ordered her to be clothed in the richest robes.
The Penguin edition specifies that these are the dead queen's richest robes.
And had her crowned queen before all the people. And when the king heard that her preservation and the escape of his son from so many dangers was entirely owing to the bird, which had given food to the one and counsel to the other, he offered her his kingdom and his life. But the bird said she desired no other reward for her services than to have Miuccio for a husband, and as she uttered the words she was changed into a beautiful maiden, and, to the great joy and satisfaction of the king and Porziella, she was given to Miuccio to wife.
Well, that's disturbing. That's a little bit beyond the sort of Stockholm Syndrome mastermaid stuff that you see in other folklore. She has known him literally since birth. Ew.
Then the newly married couple, to give still greater festivals, went their way to their own kingdom, where they were anxiously expected, every one ascribing this good fortune to the fairy, for the kindness that Porziella had done her. For at the end of the end, a good deed is never lost.
Thanks again to Joy Chen and to all of the people in her production team at LibriVox. Your saga may vary.